The people who built XRP may have already positioned themselves for what comes next, and one former Ripple insider just placed a 473 million XRP bet on it. He spent a decade inside Ripple. He sat on the board of the company that built XRP. He watched from the inside as the technology was developed, as the institutional relationships were forged, as the regulatory battles were fought in courtrooms and congressional hearings, and as the vision of what XRP could become at global financial scale became clearer with every year that passed. And then he left to build something that is either the most credible institutional bet on XRP ever constructed, or a very expensive exercise in misplaced conviction. There is no middle ground with Ashish Birla and Evernorth. But this is the part almost nobody understands. Birla is the CEO of Evernorth, the firm he describes as the largest XRP-dedicated digital asset treasury in existence. It holds over 473 million XRP. It is preparing to list on NASDAQ under the ticker XRPN through a merger with Armada Acquisition Corp. II. It runs validators on the XRP ledger. It is building yield strategies through DeFi instruments deployed directly on the XRPL. And its CEO, the former Ripple board member who helped build the technology this entire ecosystem runs on, recently sat down with Paul Barron and said something that every XRP holder needs to hear and absorb in full context. He said adoption and tokenization are shattering records. He said you have got adoption taking off, doubling in a lot of use cases, but price is sort of lagging behind. That is not a bearish statement from Birla. That is the most precise description of the current XRP market structure that anyone has published in public. Adoption is real. Tokenization is real. The institutional interest is real. And the price has not caught up to any of it. Not yet. Tonight, I'm going to walk through Birla's complete XRP thesis in full. Every prediction he published, every statement he has made about where XRP is going and why, every structural argument he has presented for why institutional adoption is not approaching but arriving. I'm going to connect his thesis to the Clarity Act and show you why its passage is the specific legislative event that closes the gap between the adoption reality he describes and the price that has not yet reflected it. Before I continue, this is not financial advice. I'm sharing publicly available information for educational purposes only. Always do your own research and consult a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions. And this is where the story becomes dangerous. The first thing to understand is who Ashish Birla actually is, because the specificity of his credibility is the foundation of everything else in this video. Birla is not a YouTube analyst. He is not a Twitter personality with a large following and no skin in the game. He is a former Ripple board member and senior executive who spent a decade building the institutional relationships, the technical partnerships, and the regulatory strategy that Ripple used to expand XRP's presence in the global banking system. He was inside the room when the 1,700 non-disclosure agreements with institutions were signed. He was inside the room when the central bank CBDC conversations were happening. He was inside the room when the on-demand liquidity corridors were being built with payment partners in more than 55 countries. When Birla says he has spent a decade building in the XRP space, that statement is literal and documented. It is not branding. And when someone with that institutional knowledge base makes the decision to leave Ripple and dedicate his professional future to building the largest XRP-focused institutional treasury in existence, that decision is itself a statement about conviction. Because when the man who helped build the technology leaves the company to bet his entire professional future on it, he is not predicting the future. He is positioning for one he already saw coming. He is not commenting from the outside. He is the largest institutional non-exchange XRP holder by size among publicly declared positions, and he is building a business model premised on the thesis that XRP is going significantly higher. Now here's where things get serious. Birla published 4 specific predictions for 2026 in December of 2025. He framed them around a single theme he stated explicitly. Institutions finally stop circling and start using this stuff in production. He said his theme for the year was really around how institutions, financial and corporate, are going to start adopting blockchain technology at scale. He said it is going to be part of everyday financial infrastructure in 2026. It is going to quietly power how money moves. His first prediction was that corporate treasury operations would become programmable as DeFi tooling collides with AI-driven automation. Specifically for XRP, this prediction points at the AMM functionality that went live on the XRP ledger, the borrow and lend protocols coming to the network, and the yield generation strategies that Evernorth itself is deploying through validator participation and DeFi instrument deployment on the XRPL. Treasury operations that are programmable through the XRPL are no longer theoretical. Evernorth's own model is the proof of concept. The firm holds 473 million XRP and is deploying it into yield strategies on the network rather than passively holding. That is the programmable corporate treasury model Burla predicted, and he is building it himself. His second prediction was that institutional DeFi would reach a turning point in 2026. He said regulatory clarity advancing and enterprise demand growing would make the next phase of digital assets not speculative but institutional, global, and value-driven. Benzinga specifically cited his February 2026 statement that institutional DeFi is reaching a turning point, particularly within the XRP ecosystem. The XRP Ledger's permission DEX went live in 2026, creating the institutional DeFi infrastructure that allows regulated entities to participate in on-chain liquidity provision within compliance-compatible environments. That is not a future development, it is a current operational reality on the network. Burla predicted it, the XRPL delivered it, and what happens next changes everything. His third prediction was that mainstream financial media would begin covering blockchain as infrastructure rather than as speculation. He said to Paul Barron, "You turn on CNBC, and how many segments do they run today on blockchain?" His point was that the narrative shift from speculative digital assets to financial infrastructure is already visible in how the mainstream media covers the space. He is right. JP Morgan completing a production transaction on the XRP ledger generated financial press coverage that framed it as payment infrastructure news, not crypto news. That framing shift is the indicator Burla identified as signaling the mainstream arrival of blockchain as institutional infrastructure. His fourth prediction was that price would eventually follow adoption, and that a new crop of investors coming in through traditional brokerage accounts rather than crypto-native platforms would be the capital that closes the gap between fundamental adoption and price. Evernorth's NASDAQ listing under the ticker XRPN is the specific vehicle Burla built to capture exactly that capital. Institutions that want XRP exposure through a regulated equity instrument rather than through direct custody of the asset itself can buy XRPN shares and get institutional-grade exposure to XRP's performance through the equity wrapper that their mandates and compliance frameworks already accommodate. It is the same template Strategy Inc. used to create the largest Bitcoin corporate treasury on NASDAQ. Burla is applying it to XRP, and he is doing it at the moment that 4 out of 4 of his 2026 predictions are tracking as confirmed. But here is the part most people are not seeing. Evernorth is not a passive holder. Burla has been explicit about this repeatedly and across multiple public venues, including the On-Chain Economy podcast, the RippleX broadcast on February 19th of 2026, and the Las Vegas XRP community event. The firm holds over 473 million XRP, but the business model is built around deploying those tokens, rather than sitting on them waiting for price appreciation. The deployment has 3 components. The first is validator participation. Evernorth runs a validator on the XRP ledger, which means it participates in the consensus process that confirms transactions on the network. Validators are how the XRP ledger maintains its decentralized structure, and running a validator is a form of network stewardship that generates positioning within the ecosystem rather than direct yield. The act of running validator infrastructure on the XRPL is the institutional signal that says this firm is committed to the long-term health of the network, not merely speculating on the price of the asset. The second is DeFi yield participation. The XRP ledger's AMM functionality allows institutions to provide liquidity to trading pairs and earn fees from that liquidity provision. Evernorth's deployment of XRP into AMM pools generates yield on holdings that passive ownership does not. Burla framed this explicitly as the difference between what Evernorth is building and the Strategy Inc. model for Bitcoin. Strategy holds Bitcoin and accumulates. Evernorth holds XRP and deploys it. The yield generation is the product, not just the holding. And this is where the story becomes dangerous for anyone still on the sidelines. The third deployment component is protocol specification development. Burla said Evernorth plans to develop specs for new protocol types it wants to see live on the XRPL. This is the institutional development contribution that moves beyond treasury management into active network building. An institutional XRP treasury that is writing protocol specifications for the XRPL is not a passive holder with a price target. It is an institutional participant in the network's development trajectory. The NASDAQ listing through XRPN brings all 3 of those operational components into a regulated equity wrapper. Institutions that buy XRPN shares are not just getting price exposure to XRP, they are getting equity exposure to a company whose operations include validator income, DeFi yield generation, and protocol development contributions. That is a fundamentally different institutional product from an XRP spot ETF. It is the institutional DeFi participation model Burla predicted would become the next phase of digital asset adoption. Now, let me connect Burla's thesis directly to the Clarity Act, because the legislation is the specific regulatory catalyst that transforms his predictions from accurate directional calls into deployable institutional reality. Burla called the convergence of regulatory clarity, DeFi infrastructure maturity, and institutional capital readiness a perfect time for Evernorth's launch. That statement was made in December of 2025. The perfect time he identified has arrived in the form of the Clarity Act markup that the Senate Banking Committee just advanced. Now, here's where things get serious. The Clarity Act's Section 401 authorizes every national bank, state bank, and credit union to offer digital asset services, including custody, lending, payments, and market making, incidental to their standard banking operations, without prior regulatory approval. For Evernorth's model, this provision means the institutional partners who want to engage with Evernorth's XRP treasury through regulated banking relationships can now do so within a federal statutory framework. The DeFi yield strategies Evernorth is building on the XRPL are designed for institutional participants. Section 401's bank authorization makes every U.S. bank a potential institutional DeFi participant on the XRPL without requiring individual regulatory approval for each engagement. The Clarity Act's non-security permanent lock-in provision ensures XRP's commodity status cannot be reversed by a future administration. For Evernorth's NASDAQ listing, this is the statutory certainty institutional equity investors require before committing capital through XRPN shares. Equity investors buying a company whose primary asset is XRP need to know that the regulatory environment for that asset cannot shift with election cycles. The Clarity Act's statutory permanence provides exactly that assurance. The Clarity Act's DeFi developer protection in Section 409 explicitly excludes protocol developers who do not take custody of user assets from broker-dealer registration requirements. Evernorth's protocol specification development work, the third pillar of its deployment model, falls directly within this protection. But this is the part almost nobody understands. The legislative framework Burla said was necessary for institutional DeFi to reach its turning point is arriving in the bill being voted on right now. Every one of the four predictions Burla made in December of 2025 was predicated on the arrival of regulatory clarity that the Clarity Act is designed to provide. His thesis was not ahead of its time. It was precisely timed for the legislative window that is opening right now. And the firm he has built to capture that window has 473 million XRP positioned to benefit from the cascade that follows. Burla said adoption is taking off, doubling in a lot of use cases, but price is lagging behind. The structural explanation for that lag is the OTC and dark pool supply mechanism that has been absorbing institutional buying without moving the public price. ETFs began sourcing XRP primarily through private OTC channels when they launched in November of 2025. OTC sourcing does not appear in public exchange order books. It does not move the price on public markets. It is invisible to retail observers watching the chart. And it has allowed approximately 1.32 billion XRP to be absorbed into institutional ETF custody without the price reflecting that absorption. This is the mechanism Burla's statement describes. Adoption is taking off, price is lagging, the lag is structural, and it is the direct result of institutional buying occurring in channels that do not move the public price. And what happens next changes everything. The resolution arrives when OTC supply exhausts and institutional buyers must go to public exchanges. At that point, the adoption that has been building invisibly in private channels becomes visible in the public price. Exchange balances have already fallen from 4 billion XRP in early 2025 to 2.6 billion, the lowest level since 2018. ETFs hold 1.32 billion in custody. Whale wallets accumulated 1.15 billion in April alone, while retail sold at $1.38. The gap between adoption reality and price reality that Burla identified is closing from both directions. Adoption is building on-chain. Supply is being absorbed off exchange. The public price has not yet reflected either development. The Clarity Act is the legislative catalyst that causes adoption and price to converge. Standard Chartered projects $4 to $8 billion in XRP ETF inflows by year-end if the bill passes. 4 to 8 billion in inflows against a market with 2.6 billion in exchange balances and 1.32 billion already in ETF custody produces the supply shock where prices must rise to unlock dormant supply concentrated at the $2 cost basis level. And Evernorth's 473 million XRP positioned across validator operations, DeFi yield strategies, and the XRPN NASDAQ listing is the institutional infrastructure that captures the value of that repricing through multiple simultaneous channels. Burla is not predicting price because he is guessing. He is predicting price because he built the institutional model that benefits from the convergence of regulatory clarity, DeFi infrastructure, and institutional capital deployment that his four predictions said would arrive in 2026. He is not a spectator. He is the architect. Now here's where things get serious for anyone still waiting. There is a pattern in this market that is repeated through every previous catalyst in this cycle, and it is about to repeat again. People will wait. They will wait for the Senate floor vote in June. They will wait for the presidential signature. They will wait for the price to break through $2 and confirm to them that the move is real. And by the time the confirmation arrives, the price they were waiting to enter at will be several dollars behind them. The institutional players inside the legislation, inside the committee process, inside the architecture that has been built over the last 14 months, are not waiting for retail confirmation. Burla is not waiting. He has already deployed 473 million tokens. He has already built the NASDAQ listing vehicle. He has already structured the DeFi yield strategies on the XRPL. The deployment is complete. The positioning is finished. What follows now is the public price reflecting what has already been built in private. Let me give you the investment calculator because Burla's thesis and the Clarity Act catalyst need to be translated into concrete portfolio numbers. At $1.46, $1,000 buys you approximately 685 XRP. At $1.70, the Clarity Act committee passage technical target based on the cup and handle pattern, those 685 tokens are worth $1,165. At $2.80, Standard Chartered's near-term institutional consensus, they are worth $1,918. At $5, the lower bound of the Post-Clarity Act year-end consensus, they are worth $3,425. At $8, Standard Chartered's upper scenario where ETF inflows reach $10 billion, they are worth $5,480. At $12, the intermediate target assuming BlackRock enters following Clarity Act passage and the institutional ratio flip completes, they are worth $8,220. At $20, the velocity model for the scenario where Burla's institutional DeFi prediction plays out at scale with bank deployment following Section 401's authorization, they are worth $13,700. At $28, Standard Chartered's 2030 institutional adoption base case, they are worth $19,180. Scale those numbers to your own position. At $5,000 invested, multiply every figure by 5. At $10,000, multiply by 10. At $25,000, multiply by 25. The structural floor at $1.28 puts maximum downside at approximately 12%, and this is where the story becomes dangerous to ignore. Burla spent a decade building XRP's institutional relationships from inside Ripple. He left to build the largest XRP institutional treasury in existence. He made 4 predictions for 2026, and all 4 are tracking as confirmed. He holds 473 million XRP deployed into the XRPL's DeFi infrastructure through validator participation and yield strategies. He is listing on NASDAQ through XRPN to bring institutional equity capital into the XRP ecosystem through a regulated wrapper. He said adoption is shattering records, and price is lagging. And the Clarity Act being voted on right now is the legislative catalyst he said was the last precondition for institutional DeFi to reach its turning point. He was not guessing. He was building for this moment. The legislation is arriving. The supply is compressed. The institutional adoption is documented. And the man who helped build XRP from the inside is deploying hundreds of millions of tokens into the network at $1.46. When someone who knows the technology from the inside, who has the institutional relationships, the 473 million token treasury, and 4 accurate predictions for 2026 already tracking as confirmed, says the price is going much higher, the question is not whether he is right. The question is whether you are positioned before the market figures it out. The headlines about XRP's repricing will come from journalists who do not have access to the rooms Burla has been inside for the last decade. The analysis on financial television will come from commentators who did not build the institutional relationships, did not write the protocol specifications, did not structure the validator infrastructure, and did not deploy hundreds of millions of tokens into yield strategies on the network. They will be reporting on what is happening. The people who built the system have already positioned for what is about to happen. Macro storms pass, infrastructure lasts. The gap between adoption reality and price reality that Birla described in his Paul Barron interview is closing from both directions, on a legislative timeline that the Senate is moving through in real time, with a supply structure that is already compressed to its tightest level in years. The architects don't speculate, they build. And by the time the rest of the market sees what they built, the entrance they used will already be closed. Smash that like button if this connected dots about Birla and Evernorth that nobody else has connected for you. Drop your XRP target, and whether you believe Birla's fourth prediction that price follows adoption in the comments. Let's see what this community has priced in before the Clarity Act closes the gap. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when the institutional DeFi turning point Birla predicted becomes visible in the price action, when XRPN begins trading on Nasdaq, when BlackRock crosses the threshold, and when Section 401's 90-day bank authorization window opens, my breakdown drops within hours of each event. The adoption has been building, the price has been lagging, the gap is closing. See you on the other side.